They called the creature in Blackwood Forest a monster, but the greatest mistake anyone ever made was believing kindness couldn't reach what fear never could. Every town has a place people pretend doesn't exist. In Ashcroft Hollow, it was Blackwood Forest, a stretch of ancient pine that swallowed sunlight long before dusk and carried whispers through its branches even when the wind stood still. Children were warned never to wander near its edge. Hunters refused to cross the old stone bridge after sunset. Delivery drivers added 20 extra miles to avoid the narrow road that cut through its heart. They all believed something lived there, something wild enough to make even the coyotes fall silent. Grace Carter had heard every story. She simply had no reason to believe any of them. Born completely blind, Grace had spent 23 years understanding the world through sounds, scents, textures, and the tiny changes in the air most people never noticed. She couldn't see the twisted shadows everyone feared. She couldn't watch the branches sway like reaching hands. To her, Blackwood Forest smelled of damp cedar, wildflowers after rain, and moss warming beneath the afternoon sun. It sounded like birds greeting one another, squirrels darting across bark, and streams weaving patiently around old stones. Fear had always belonged to people who could see. Grace carried only curiosity. Every Tuesday and Friday, after finishing her shift shelving books at the small public library, she folded her white cane, tucked it into her canvas bag, and walked the familiar trail home with slow confidence. The shortcut saved nearly 40 minutes, which meant she could still make dinner before calling her grandmother across town. Most evenings, the forest welcomed her with peaceful silence broken only by distant owls and rustling leaves. Tonight felt different. The birds had stopped singing. Even the insects seemed strangely quiet. Grace paused, tilting her head. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. She listened carefully until another sound drifted through the trees. It was faint, uneven, almost hidden beneath the breeze. A slow breath. Then another. Heavy, labored, human, or at least close enough. She turned toward the sound without hesitation. Fallen branches brushed against her jacket as she followed the breathing deeper between the pines. The ground softened beneath her boots, damp from rain earlier that afternoon. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily from a broken branch. The breathing grew louder. Whoever it belonged to was alive, but barely moving. Grace knelt carefully, extending both hands until her fingertips met rough fabric. A coat. Cold. Torn in places. She reached farther and found a trembling hand resting against the earth. It was colder than anyone's hand should have been, yet beneath her fingertips she detected the faintest pulse. Slow. Powerful. Somehow unfamiliar. "It's okay," she whispered with the gentle confidence she had learned from years of comforting frightened children during library story hours. "I'm not here to hurt you." The breathing stopped for one terrifying second. Then a low growl rumbled somewhere deep within the stranger's chest, raw with exhaustion rather than anger. Most people would have run. Grace only smiled softly. "You sound scared," she said. "That makes two of us." Her fingers searched carefully until they found what felt like thick metal wrapped around one wrist. A chain, cold as winter steel. She frowned. Who would leave someone out here like this? Somewhere high above, unseen clouds rolled across the evening sky. Far away, thunder murmured like an ancient warning. Hidden beneath centuries of silence, something inside the chained stranger slowly began to awaken for the very first time, because someone who could not see had chosen to stay instead of walking away. Grace kept one hand lightly around the stranger's wrist while the other searched the ground beside him until her fingers brushed against a weathered backpack. She opened it by touch alone. A small bottle of water. A clean dish towel she always carried. A simple first aid pouch the librarian insisted every employee keep for emergencies. "Looks like today was the right day to be prepared," she murmured, more to calm herself than anyone else. The stranger remained perfectly still except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Every few seconds another quiet growl escaped him, softer now, almost like someone trapped inside a terrible dream. Grace soaked the towel with cool water and carefully dabbed his forehead. His skin was astonishingly cold, far colder than the evening air. She hesitated. Fever made people warm. Exhaustion made them pale. Nothing about this man made sense. Yet beneath the impossible chill, she sensed life refusing to let go. "I cannot leave you here," she whispered. Even if you tell me to. The stranger answered only with silence. Somewhere above them, a raven called once before disappearing into the quiet. Grace listened carefully again. The forest still felt wrong. Too still. As though every living creature had stepped aside and was waiting for something neither she nor the injured man could yet understand. She reached for the chain wrapped around his wrist. Thick metal links, unusually smooth, stretched away into the roots of a massive oak tree. She followed them with careful fingers until she found a heavy iron lock. It felt old, older than anything she had ever touched inside the town museum. She tugged gently. Nothing moved. Whoever had secured him here had intended for him to stay. Grace frowned. That is not right. She searched the ground again until her fingers closed around a jagged stone. It would never break iron, but perhaps she could loosen something. She tapped carefully around the lock, listening instead of looking. Metal answered with dull echoes. Again and again. After several patient minutes, she heard the smallest click. She froze. Another careful tap. A second click. The lock loosened just enough for her fingers to twist it free. The heavy chain slipped onto the damp earth with a muffled clatter. Instantly, the stranger inhaled sharply. The sound echoed through the trees like someone taking a first breath after years beneath deep water. Grace instinctively leaned back. She could feel the air itself changing. It became colder, heavier, charged with invisible energy that made the tiny hairs on her arms stand upright. The man did not attack. He did not even stand. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward her. Grace could not see his face, but she felt his attention settle on her with startling clarity. It was unlike anything she had experienced before. Not threatening, not gentle either. Ancient, curious, almost disbelieving. There, she said softly. That has to feel a little better. His breathing steadied. The growling faded until only quiet breaths remained between them. Grace smiled with relief. See? I knew you were not as frightening as everyone probably thinks. A single leaf drifted down somewhere nearby. Then another. Far beyond the trees, tires crunched over gravel. Grace heard at least 3 vehicles stop near the old bridge. Doors opened almost together. Several pairs of boots stepped onto the forest trail with deliberate precision. Low voices carried through the evening air, too distant to understand, but organized enough to belong to people searching for something. Grace turned her head toward the sound. Do not worry, she whispered to the stranger. Maybe they are here to help. Beside her, the man's heartbeat suddenly became stronger, faster, each measured beat carrying quiet strength instead of fading weakness. Whatever memories had been buried inside him were beginning to awaken, and somewhere beyond the trees, people who had spent years searching for the impossible had finally arrived at the place where destiny had been waiting all along. The footsteps beyond the trees stopped all at once. Whoever had entered Blackwood Forest knew exactly where they were going. Grace listened as the strangers spread out with practiced precision, their boots disturbing wet leaves only a few yards apart. They were searching, not wandering. She lowered her voice until it became almost a whisper. Can you stand? The man beside her did not answer with words. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly around the damp earth beneath him. The movement was small, but it carried remarkable strength compared to only moments before. Grace carefully slipped one arm beneath his shoulder. He was far heavier than she expected, yet he rose with surprising balance, as though every instinct inside him still remembered how to survive even if his mind remained clouded. For one brief moment his weight rested against her. His breathing slowed again. The low, restless growl faded into silence. That is better, Grace said with a gentle smile. Just lean on me until we find somewhere safe. Hidden among the towering pines, the stranger lowered his head slightly toward the sound of her voice. His silver-white skin remained cold, but the shaking had almost stopped. Somewhere deep inside him, a forgotten memory stirred. A soft voice from another lifetime. A promise made centuries ago. A kindness freely given without fear or expectation. He could not remember the face. He could only remember the feeling. It was the same feeling standing beside him now. Far beyond the trees, another group watched from complete silence. They wore dark coats that blended into the evening shadows, their presence so still that even the forest seemed unwilling to reveal them. One man lowered a pair of field binoculars with visible disbelief. Impossible, he breathed. He is standing. Another answered quietly. he should still be feral. No human has survived approaching him before. A woman beside them never looked away from the distant figures. Forget the king. Look at the girl. What about her? She released the restraint. Silence followed. None of them understood how an ordinary human could have opened an ancient lock designed to hold the strongest vampire alive. They had spent months searching for their missing ruler. Elite trackers had failed. Ancient scholars had failed. Entire royal patrols had disappeared following false trails. Yet now a blind librarian had calmly walked into the forest, spoken to him with kindness, and somehow accomplished what centuries of planning never could. Back beneath the trees, Grace slowly guided the stranger toward a narrow game trail she knew well. There is an old ranger cabin about half a mile from here, she explained. Nobody uses it anymore, but it stays dry when it rains. You can rest there tonight. The stranger suddenly stopped walking. Grace paused with him. The air changed again. This time it was not cold. It was alert. Every muscle in the mysterious man's body became perfectly still. His head turned slightly toward the approaching search party. Grace heard nothing unusual beyond distant footsteps, but he appeared to hear far more than any ordinary person could. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was rough, quiet, and worn by what sounded like countless years of silence. Run. The single word barely rose above the whispering leaves. Grace blinked in surprise before offering a small laugh. I appreciate the advice, but I cannot leave someone behind. The stranger closed his eyes as though struggling against something invisible inside himself. Another unfamiliar sound drifted through the forest. Not footsteps, not voices. A long, low horn echoed from somewhere beyond the bridge. Every hidden observer froze instantly. One man whispered with growing alarm, "The hunters have arrived first." The woman beside him inhaled sharply. "If they find her before we do, everything changes." Deep within the forest, the silent king slowly opened his eyes, and although Grace could not see them, the darkness around them seemed to hold its breath. Grace reached for the stranger's sleeve and gently tugged. "Please," she whispered. "The cabin is close. We can rest there until whoever is outside the forest goes home." For several long seconds he did not move. His breathing remained perfectly steady, but every instinct inside him seemed fixed on the distant sounds echoing through the trees. Finally, almost reluctantly, he followed her. They walked slowly along the narrow trail. Grace counted each familiar landmark beneath her feet. 7 wooden steps across the shallow creek. 12 paces over the old stone path. A fallen cedar whose rough bark brushed her fingertips every single season. She had memorized the forest years ago, transforming darkness into certainty one careful step at a time. The stranger remained silent beside her. Yet something had changed. He no longer leaned against her for support. Instead, his footsteps had become almost soundless. Grace smiled faintly. "You are feeling stronger already." There was no answer, but she sensed him turning slightly toward her. She could almost feel his curiosity. Most people eventually asked the same question. How did she know where she was going without seeing? He never asked. Somehow, his silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. Several minutes later, the scent of aged pine boards drifted through the cool evening air. Grace stopped beside a small wooden porch. "We made it," she said with quiet satisfaction. She climbed the 2 creaking steps, found the old spare key exactly where the retired ranger always left it beneath a loose flower pot, and unlocked the cabin door. The room welcomed them with the familiar smell of cedar, fireplace ash, and clean mountain air. "It is not fancy," Grace said, guiding him inside, "but it will keep the rain away." She closed the door behind them and felt her way toward a shelf where an oil lantern usually rested. After several careful attempts, a warm golden glow filled the cabin. Grace never saw the light, but she heard the soft crackle of the flame and smiled anyway. Across the room, the stranger stood completely motionless. His pale face reflected the lantern's warmth without seeming to absorb it. His silver eyes slowly examined every corner of the cabin before settling on Grace once more. Hundreds of years of memory drifted through his mind in scattered fragments. Stone castles, endless winters, royal councils, ancient promises. None of them felt as clear as the simple image before him now. A blind young woman moving confidently through a room she could not see. humming quietly while searching cupboards for supplies she hoped a stranger might need. Grace opened an old cabinet and laughed softly. Someone left canned soup. Lucky us. She found a small pot, poured water from a rain barrel into it, and placed everything over the fireplace. I am not sure if you are hungry, but warm food usually helps people feel better. The stranger watched every movement without speaking. The unfamiliar feeling growing inside him disturbed him far more than the chains ever had. He had forgotten what ordinary kindness looked like. Forgotten that compassion expected nothing in return. Forgotten that someone could care for another soul without knowing a single name or title. Outside, hidden among the towering pines, 3 figures silently reached the edge of the clearing. One lifted a hand, signaling everyone else to remain hidden. They stared toward the faint lantern glowing through the cabin window. He entered willingly. One whispered in disbelief. He has not destroyed the shelter. Another answered, he is listening to her. The oldest among them lowered his head with quiet reverence. Then the stories were true. Only a heart untouched by fear could reach him before his mind returned. At that exact moment, another sound drifted through the forest. Vehicle doors slammed shut much closer than before. Flashlights swept across distant branches. Calm voices called to one another with disciplined confidence. They were no longer searching aimlessly. They had found the trail leading directly toward the cabin. The soup had barely begun to warm when Grace heard the crunch of gravel outside the cabin. It was different from the careful footsteps she had noticed before. These were confident, organized, and growing closer with every passing second. She quietly lowered the wooden spoon and turned her head toward the front door. Someone is coming, she said. Across the room, the stranger had already moved. She never heard his footsteps. One heartbeat, he stood beside the fireplace. The next, she sensed his presence near the window. Silence settled over the cabin again. Grace listened carefully. 5 people. Heavy boots. Expensive flashlights. Thick jackets brushing against branches. They were not hikers. They sounded like people who expected to find exactly what they were looking for. A polite knock echoed through the small cabin. Hello, a man's voice called. Anyone inside? Grace relaxed slightly. Maybe they are park rangers. She started toward the door. Before her hand reached the doorknob, the stranger gently caught her wrist. His touch remained surprisingly cold, yet careful. He did not pull her back. He simply stopped her. No, he said quietly. It was only one word, but this time his voice carried calm certainty instead of confusion. Grace hesitated. You know them? He remained silent. Outside, another voice joined the first. Miss, we know someone entered this cabin. We are not here to cause trouble. We only need to ask a few questions. Grace frowned thoughtfully. Their words sounded friendly enough, yet something in their breathing felt wrong. Calm voices often hit impatient hearts. She had learned that long ago. Another knock came, louder than before. Please open the door. Grace took a slow breath. I should at least speak to them. The stranger released her wrist, but did not step away. Instead, he positioned himself quietly beside the doorway where he would remain hidden if the door opened only a little. Grace reached for the handle and opened it several inches. Cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the scent of wet pine and engine exhaust. Good evening, she said politely. Can I help you? The man outside answered with practiced warmth. My name is Daniel. We are part of a search team. We received reports that someone dangerous was seen in this area. Grace nodded slowly. I found an injured man in the forest. The silence outside lasted only a fraction of a second before another voice quickly asked, Is he still inside with you? Grace sensed several people shifting their weight at once. Their breathing became quicker. Their boots scraped lightly against the porch. Without seeing their faces, she suddenly realized they were not relieved. They were excited. He is resting, she answered honestly. He has been hurt for a long time. One of the men laughed softly, though there was no kindness in the sound. Miss, you have no idea who that is. Grace smiled gently. You are right. I do not know his name. Then step outside, Daniel replied. Let us handle the situation. Grace remained where she was. Has he harmed anyone? No one answered immediately. She continued quietly. When I found him, he was chained to a tree. He could barely stand. He has not threatened me once. The men exchanged whispers too low for most people to hear. Grace caught only fragments. She trusts him. Unexpected. Move carefully. Behind her, the stranger stood perfectly still. His heartbeat remained slow and controlled despite every instinct urging him to act. He listened to every conversation, every shifting boot, every heartbeat outside the cabin. Long-forgotten memories continued, returning piece by piece, along with the discipline of a king who had once ruled not through fear alone, but through restraint. Daniel's friendly tone disappeared. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, speaking her last name for the first time, "please step away from the man and come with us. You are standing beside someone the world has been searching for longer than you can possibly imagine." Grace's expression softened with confusion. She had never told them her name. Grace's fingers remained lightly wrapped around the edge of the cabin door. She did not step backward. She did not step outside. Instead, she tilted her head with quiet curiosity. "How do you know my name?" The question lingered in the cool night air. Daniel smiled, but the warmth in his voice no longer matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. "We know many things, Miss Carter. We know where you work. We know the path you take home every Tuesday and Friday. We know you are kind enough to help strangers." Grace felt a faint chill. Those were not the words of someone introducing himself. Those were the words of someone who had been watching for a long time. "Why would anyone watch me?" she asked softly. Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because sometimes ordinary people stumble into extraordinary situations." Before Grace could reply, another man spoke from the porch. "Enough conversation. Bring her outside." His tone carried impatience instead of concern. Grace instinctively took one slow step backward into the cabin. The stranger behind her remained silent, yet she sensed his attention sharpen like the sudden stillness before a thunderstorm. "I do not think I want to leave," Grace said honestly. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Miss Carter, we are trying to protect you." From the man inside? "Yes." Grace lowered her voice. "Then why does he seem less frightening than all of you?" No one answered. Outside, several flashlights shifted position at once. Their bright beams swept across the porch, climbed the cabin walls, and reached through the partially open doorway. Grace could not see the light, but she felt its warmth brush across her face. The stranger quietly turned away from it, remaining hidden within the darker corner of the room. Another vehicle stopped somewhere behind the first group. More doors opened. More footsteps approached. The forest, silent only minutes earlier, now held dozens of steady heartbeats. Hidden beyond the trees, the cloaked observers exchanged worried glances. The oldest among them whispered, "Too many have arrived." "Should we intervene?" another asked. The old man slowly shook his head. "Not yet. His Majesty has not given the command." Back inside the cabin, Grace carefully reached toward the stranger until her fingertips found his sleeve. "Do not worry," she whispered. "I will not let anyone force you outside if you are still hurt." The moment her hand rested against his arm, something remarkable happened. The stranger closed his eyes. His breathing, already calm, became perfectly steady. Memories that had been scattered like broken glass suddenly began fitting together. A throne carved from black stone. Silver banners moving above an ancient city. Loyal voices pledging eternal service. One name echoed through every forgotten memory. Lucian, King Lucian Ashcroft. The identity returned all at once, not with confusion, but with quiet certainty. He remembered who he was. He remembered what had been taken from him. More importantly, he remembered the young woman standing between him and complete darkness. Outside, Daniel slowly reached into his coat and removed a small silver pendant hanging from a leather cord. He held it toward the doorway. "Miss Carter," he called gently, "please move aside." Grace heard the chain lightly tapping against the metal pendant. The soft ringing instantly changed the air inside the cabin. Lucian's shoulders became tense. His jaw tightened. His heartbeat deepened into slow, powerful echoes that seemed almost impossible for one person alone. Grace turned toward him with concern. "Are you all right?" He opened his eyes. Their silver calm had changed, not into anger, but into complete awareness. Every trace of confusion had vanished. His posture straightened effortlessly. The exhaustion disappeared from his voice when he finally spoke. "Grace." It was the first time he had ever said her name. His words carried quiet authority that filled the tiny cabin without becoming loud. Grace smiled with relief. "You remembered." Lucian looked toward the closed darkness beyond the doorway where every heartbeat waited. Then he gently stepped forward until he stood beside her instead of behind her. Outside, every conversation stopped. Every flashlight lowered. Every heartbeat skipped with the same realization. The king they had searched for was no longer lost. For a long moment, no one moved. The forest itself seemed to fall into complete silence, as though every living thing had recognized the change before the people standing outside the cabin could accept it. Daniel slowly lowered the silver pendant in his hand. His confident posture disappeared, replaced by unmistakable hesitation. He stared through the doorway at the tall man beside Grace. The pale face was no longer clouded by exhaustion. The quiet eyes no longer wandered without purpose. They were calm, focused, and impossibly ancient. Lucian stepped onto the wooden porch with measured grace. Every movement carried effortless dignity, not because he wished to impress anyone, but because power had always belonged to him. Grace heard the floorboards creak beneath his feet and smiled gently. "You sound stronger," she said. Lucian glanced toward her before returning his attention to the people gathered below the steps. His expression softened for only an instant. "Because of you," he answered quietly. The words were simple, yet every person standing outside heard them with stunned disbelief. None of them had imagined their king would speak with such warmth to an ordinary human. Daniel swallowed carefully before lowering his head. Around him, the members of his search team exchanged uncertain glances. They had rehearsed countless possibilities during months of searching. None of those plans included finding the ancient ruler standing peacefully beside a blind librarian. Before anyone could speak again, another group emerged from the surrounding forest. Cloaked figures stepped silently from between the towering pines, their movements disciplined and respectful. The oldest among them approached until he reached the edge of the clearing. Without hesitation, he placed one knee upon the ground and bowed his head deeply. Every person behind him immediately followed. The quiet motion spread through the forest like falling leaves. One after another, the newcomers knelt without a single command being spoken. Grace heard clothing brushing against the earth and frowned with gentle confusion. "What is happening?" she whispered. Lucian answered without taking his eyes from the gathering before him. "My people have found me." The old man remained kneeling. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice filled with relief that trembled despite years of discipline. "The kingdom has waited for your return." Lucian remained silent for several heartbeats. He slowly looked across every familiar face. Some had grown older. Some carried fresh lines of worry. Yet every one of them had continued searching long after hope should have faded. "Rise," Lucian said calmly. The single word carried quiet authority. Every cloaked figure stood together. Daniel instinctively stepped backward. The confidence he had displayed only minutes earlier had completely vanished. We believed your Majesty was beyond recovery," he admitted carefully. Lucian regarded him with steady composure. Belief often follows fear. No anger entered his voice. No accusation followed. Somehow that calmness unsettled everyone far more than shouting ever could. Grace reached lightly toward Lucian until her fingertips rested against the sleeve of his coat. "I am glad your family found you," she said sincerely. "No one should be alone for so long." Several members of the royal guard exchanged astonished looks. She had spoken to their king exactly as she had spoken to him when she believed he was an injured stranger. There was no fear, no attempt to flatter him, only quiet kindness. The elderly advisor slowly turned toward Grace, studying her with growing wonder. "Your Majesty," he asked softly, "is this the young woman who freed you?" Lucian answered without hesitation. "She did more than free me." His gaze rested gently upon Grace. "She reminded me who I chose to become long before anyone called me king." A cool breeze swept through the clearing, carrying away the last traces of tension. Even the restless birds slowly returned to the branches overhead. The forest no longer felt haunted. It felt peaceful again. Yet as the advisor continued observing Grace, his expression gradually changed. His respectful smile faded into thoughtful concern. He looked not at her face, but at the closed eyes that had never once searched for light. Then he quietly whispered words that only Lucian heard. "Your Majesty, the ancient seal is still upon her." Grace stood quietly beside Lucian, unaware that every eye in the clearing had shifted toward her. She sensed only the changing rhythm of the silence. It was no longer filled with suspicion. It carried something gentler now, something almost reverent. She smiled uncertainly. "Did I miss something?" she asked. The elderly advisor stepped forward with slow, respectful movements until he stopped several feet away. "Miss Carter," he said softly. May I ask you a question? Grace nodded. Of course. Have you always been blind? She answered without hesitation. Since the day I was born. At least, that is what my grandmother always told me. The old man lowered his gaze thoughtfully. And have you ever dreamed of light? Grace laughed quietly. That is an interesting question. I do not know what light looks like, but sometimes I dream about colors I cannot describe. They feel warm instead of bright, almost like music. A murmur spread through the cloaked figures standing behind him. Lucian noticed it immediately. Explain, he said calmly. The advisor folded his hands before him. Your Majesty, there are stories preserved only within the oldest royal archives. They speak of children born with their sight hidden, not because they lacked vision, but because something far greater had been sealed away. Grace listened with polite curiosity. You make it sound like a fairy tale. Most fairy tales begin with forgotten history, the old man replied. Lucian remained perfectly still. Fragments of memory continued surfacing from centuries long past. Ancient libraries beneath marble towers. Scholars recording prophecies by candlelight. A name that had almost vanished from history. The veiled seers. Men and women who never relied upon ordinary sight because they perceived truths hidden from everyone else. He looked toward Grace with growing realization. What else? He asked. The advisor answered carefully. Legend says the final bloodline disappeared hundreds of years ago. To protect the last child, an ancient seal concealed both the gift and the memory of it. Daniel, still standing several yards away, frowned in confusion. You are suggesting this librarian belongs to some forgotten royal bloodline. I am suggesting nothing, the advisor replied. I am recognizing what stands before us. Grace gently folded her hands together. I think there has been a misunderstanding. I organize books. I volunteer at the community reading center. I burn toast almost every Sunday morning. I promise there is nothing mysterious about me. Soft laughter rippled through several members of the royal guard. Even Lucian's expression warmed with the faintest hint of a smile. That, he said quietly, may be exactly why no one ever found you. Grace turned toward the sound of his voice. Found me for what? Before anyone could answer, a cool breeze swept across the clearing. The lantern inside the cabin flickered unexpectedly, though no one had touched it. Grace instinctively lifted her face toward the wind. For one brief moment, countless unfamiliar sounds filled her awareness. She heard distant rivers flowing beneath mountains she had never visited. She heard wings beating high above clouds. She heard dozens of steady heartbeats surrounding her, each one as clear as if it stood only inches away. The overwhelming sensation lasted only a second before fading completely. Grace blinked in surprise. That was strange, she whispered. What happened? The advisor's face became pale with astonishment. The seal responded. Lucian stepped closer, his voice remaining calm despite the realization growing inside him. Grace. She turned toward him immediately. Yes. When the wind touched you. Did you hear anything? She hesitated. Everything. Silence settled over the clearing once more. The old advisor slowly bowed his head, not to the king this time, but to the young woman standing beside him. Your Majesty, he said with quiet certainty, the prophecy did not end. It has only just begun. The forest remained quiet long after the advisor's words faded into the night. Grace stood in thoughtful silence, trying to understand a future she had never imagined. She had left the library expecting an ordinary walk home. Instead, she now found herself surrounded by strangers who spoke of forgotten kingdoms, ancient prophecies, and a king who looked at her not with obligation, but with quiet gratitude. She folded her hands together and smiled with gentle uncertainty. I think everyone is giving me far too much credit, she said. I only helped someone who needed help. Lucian turned toward her. The lantern's warm glow rested softly across his pale features, but it was no longer the face of a lost soul. It was the face of a ruler who had remembered both his kingdom and the promise that had guided him through centuries. That, he said calmly, is precisely why your kindness changed everything. Grace lowered her head with a shy laugh. My grandmother always said that helping someone should never depend on who they are. Lucian nodded almost imperceptibly. She was wise. The elderly advisor stepped forward once more. Your Majesty, the castle has waited a very long time for your return. The council will wish to welcome you home before sunrise. Lucian remained silent for a moment. Then he asked a question no one expected. Will there be a place for Grace? Every member of the royal guard looked toward the young woman standing quietly beside him. The advisor smiled warmly. There will always be a place for the one who restored hope to a kingdom. Grace quickly shook her head. I appreciate that, but my life is here. My apartment is small, my books need organizing tomorrow morning, and my grandmother will worry if I disappear without calling her. Soft laughter spread through the clearing, easing the last of the evening's tension. Lucian's expression grew thoughtful. Then we begin with your grandmother. Grace looked surprised. You would meet her? If she raised the woman who reminded a king what compassion feels like, then I owe her my thanks. Grace smiled more brightly than she had all evening. She will probably insist that you stay for pie. Then I will gladly accept. The old advisor quietly observed the exchange before speaking once more. Your Majesty, perhaps destiny does not always arrive with crowns and ceremonies. Sometimes it arrives carrying a library card and a first aid kit. Even Lucian allowed himself a faint smile. Perhaps. Above them, the clouds slowly parted. Moonlight filtered through the towering pines, touching the old cabin, the quiet clearing, and the winding trail where everything had begun only hours before. The forest no longer carried whispers of fear. It carried the peaceful sounds of returning birds and the gentle rustling of leaves welcoming a new beginning. Grace lifted her face toward the cool breeze. The forest sounds happier, she said softly. Lucian listened for a moment before answering. It is. Together they started down the narrow trail leading out of Blackwood Forest, not as a frightened stranger and a lost king, but as two people whose lives had quietly changed each other forever. Behind them, the royal guard followed at a respectful distance, while ahead, the first lights of Ashcroft Hollow shimmered beyond the trees. None of them noticed the ancient stone marker standing beside the forgotten bridge. Hidden beneath layers of moss, a weathered inscription slowly began to glow with a faint silver light for the first time in centuries. The old symbols formed only a single sentence before fading once more into silence. The guardian has awakened, and the one who walks beside her has finally come home. Sometimes the greatest miracles begin not with extraordinary power, but with an ordinary act of kindness freely given.